Mr. John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House of Commons today rightly pays tribute to a great Prime Minister and a great parliamentarian. We, who sit as Conservative members of Parliament on this side, salute someone who was one of our most successful and influential leaders of our party. And those of us who were privileged enough to know her and to work for her remember an inspiring figure, but also a warm and compassionate person who inspired tremendous loyalty amongst her staff. I was 15 when she became leader of my party, and like so many of my generation and those that followed, I was influenced in my politically formative years by her exposition of ideas and her beliefs, which were developed with Keith Joseph out of the Centre for Policy Studies. And it was that clear articulation of an ideological philosophy that attracted me to want to become involved in Conservative politics. 3 years later, I was lucky enough to meet her for the first time when I began to work for the Conservative Party. I was in her office on the day that Erin Neave was killed, and I was also working for her in Downing Street some years later on the day that Ian Gow was assassinated. Two terrible blows to her personally. She was a controversial and sometimes divisive figure. It was inevitable, given the scale of the challenges that she and her government faced. She had to make what were difficult and unpopular decisions. But it was her conviction and her strength of purpose which enabled her to achieve what she did, often in the face of enormous opposition. It was opposition that she confronted right from the start of her career. I think the Leader of the Opposition referred to her time at Oxford. She became active in the Oxford University Conservatives Association, and indeed president of it, because women were not allowed to participate in the Oxford Union. She then, once she became leader of her party, confronted huge opposition within our own ranks. There were many people who resented her background, coming from a middle-class family in Grantham. They resented her sex, and they also resented her ideological certainty. All these things were certainly novel for the Conservative Party at that time. Her strength of purpose allowed her to confront our country's enemies. We have referred to General Galtieri and to the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Her role in persuading George Bush that she must confront Saddam Hussein when he invaded and occupied Kuwait, and also her role with Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev in bringing about the end of communism. But she was also a pragmatist and a realist. She was responsible for the Lancaster House Agreement, which ended white rule in Rhodesia and ushered in black majority government there. She negotiated the hand-back of Hong Kong to the Chinese, and as we have heard, she signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I first worked for her directly during the two general election campaigns of 1983 and 1987, when I accompanied her on her tour of the country. It was my first experience of her punishing workload, her extraordinary attention to detail, and her occasionally somewhat unreasonable demands. But I also saw at first hand her instinctive feel for what the aspirations and the beliefs of the people in Britain were, and it was her identity with those people that allowed her to articulate so clearly what they wanted. And actually, it was that then delivered in those two general elections successively majorities for the Conservative Party of 144 and 102. Some of us might think those were the days. In 1988, she asked me to become her political secretary in Downing Street. I saw then, at first hand, her huge respect for Parliament itself. She occupied the position of Prime Minister, but she never forgot that she was also the Member of Parliament for Finchley, and she believed that it was her duty to come here not just to speak, but to vote as well in the division lobbies on their behalf. I used to help her with preparation for Prime Minister's questions. In those days, it lasted just 15 minutes and took place twice a week. She used to spend something like 6 or 7 hours preparing for that 15-minute session. We used to go through the briefs from every government department across Whitehall, where they set out the exposition of the government's policy and the line to take. Sometimes she didn't think it was very good. I would be sent to ring up the private secretary of the minister in the department to tell him that the Prime Minister didn't like this particular line to take. Occasionally, she strode across the study and took the phone from my hands and told the private secretary herself that not only did she not like the line to take, occasionally she didn't even like the policy either. She had a remarkable ability every now and again to somehow distance herself from the policies of the government, which she also was the leader of. There are one or two misconceptions which I would just like to set right. I listened carefully to the honourable gentleman for Walsall North. But it is the case that whilst Margaret Thatcher was opposed to economic sanctions against South Africa, she was fiercely opposed to apartheid as well. And she argued with the South African government that they should release Nelson Mandela from prison. And that is something which was recognised, if not by the honourable gentleman, then by Nelson Mandela himself. I would also say to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who I'm sorry is no longer here, yes, she did say there is no such thing as society. But she went on to say what there is that there are families and there are communities. And she set out the fact that if individuals see people who are less well off or in need, they bear a personal and moral responsibility, not just to let society, some amorphous body, take responsibility, but for them themselves to act. That is why it is such an appalling twisting of her message that people now claim she said there is no such thing as society. I also saw at first hand her immense personal kindness and her compassion. As has been said, it was often to the most junior members of her staff. The famous occasion when the waitress spilt the soup on Geoffrey Howe. It wasn't Geoffrey Howe she worried about, it was the waitress. She was always insistent that she could never be late, particularly for funerals. Sadly, I used to accompany her occasionally to funerals, and we used to sit in lay-bys for 15 or 20 minutes because we'd set off so early just in case there would be heavy traffic, because she could not possibly allow herself to be late. There are members on this side of the House, but there are also members on the other side of the House who I know received personal handwritten letters from her when they experienced a tragedy in their own private lives or with their families. She had an enormous compassion. If ever she found somebody was alone at Christmas, she would always say they should come and spend it with checkers with her. Indeed, famously, Ronnie Miller, the playwright, told me that he used to spend many months trying to think of excuses why he was going to be busy, because the idea of being with Margaret Thatcher at Christmas might not have been the most relaxing way to spend it. After she stood down as Prime Minister, she on several occasions came to support me in Essex. Essex has always been Thatcher country, and I was pleased to see that when she came to Malden, the constituency I represent, at the election in which I first stood as candidate after she had stood down as Prime Minister, the pavements had crowds 4 or 5 deep who turned out to see her. Not all of them actually were supporters of her, or probably even supporters of mine, but they wanted to be there because they recognised that she played such a hugely important role in their lives and in the life of their country. And even now today, when I occasionally meet people from different countries, other parliamentarians, sometimes even leaders, if I say to them that I served as Margaret Thatcher's political secretary, it is that which alights their interest, and in many ways it is that of which I am most proud. It was a privilege to know her, an even greater privilege to have worked for someone who was one of the greatest Prime Ministers this country has ever had.